My parents did not even bother to show up to my wedding day. They left 5 empty seats in the front row, choosing a networking party over their own daughter. But exactly 14 minutes after I posted a photo of my brand new $140,000 Porsche Panamera on Instagram, my phone suddenly rang. It was my mother calling me for the first time in 2 years, demanding a mandatory family meeting for the very next day. They thought they were going to manipulate me, corner me, and guilt trip me into funding their fake crumbling empire. They had absolutely no idea that I came to that house armed with a digital surprise that would burn their entire flawless facade right to the ground and send their favorite son-in-law straight to a federal holding cell. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and I am the founder of a highly successful cybersecurity firm based right here in the South. My husband, Jamal, is 36. He is a brilliant executive chef who owns an upscale soul food fusion restaurant that is currently booked out for 6 months straight. Before I tell you the story of how I systematically dismantled my family's toxic web of lies, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been treated like an absolute stranger by your own blood, or if you have ever had to build your success in silence while the people who should have loved you doubted every single step you took. Trust me, you are going to want to hear how this massive betrayal finally ended. Growing up in our household in Atlanta, I learned very early on that love was nothing more than a transaction. You either fit the exact mold my parents created for you, or you simply did not exist in their world. For 30 long years, I was the invisible scapegoat. My younger sister Imani, who is 31 now, was the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong. The dynamic in our house was entirely suffocating. Imani was the pageant queen, the aspiring socialite, the girl with the perfect smile, and the right group of wealthy friends. My parents happily poured tens of thousands of dollars into her wardrobe, her hair appointments, her cars, and her highly curated social life. I, on the other hand, was the quiet tech nerd hiding in the glow of my computer monitor in my bedroom. I realized early on that reading code made more sense to me than trying to decipher my parents' conditional affection. When I won a massive statewide coding competition in my junior year of high school, a victory that came with a full college scholarship, my father casually patted my shoulder and told me not to spend too much time staring at screens, because boys do not like girls who are smarter than them. Yet when Imani was crowned runner-up at a local beauty pageant, that same year my parents threw a catered celebration at our house that cost more than the scholarship I had just won. I realized then that my quiet accomplishments would never be loud enough to drown out my sister's mere existence. While I worked 3 different part-time jobs to pay for my living expenses in college, Imani was maxing out credit cards on designer bags, knowing my parents would seamlessly pay off her balances without a single word of discipline. To understand why they treated me this way, you have to understand my parents. Calvin and Patricia are what people call an Atlanta power couple. They run a prominent community nonprofit foundation that allegedly focuses on youth education and community development. To the outside world, they are generous, philanthropic, and deeply involved in uplifting the city. Behind closed doors, they are entirely obsessed with high society appearances. Everything they do, every dollar they raise, every event they attend, is strictly for a photo opportunity or a magazine feature. They care infinitely more about rubbing shoulders with the city elite politicians and wealthy donors than actually helping anyone in need. Their home is an enormous, sprawling estate in a gated community that always felt more like a museum than a place where a family lived and loved. You could not sit on the good furniture. You could not wear the wrong clothes downstairs. And you certainly could not bring up anything that did not make the family look absolutely flawless to the outside eye. This toxic obsession with status and image reached its absolute peak when Imani met and married Trent. Trent is 33 years old, white, and a so-called wealth manager. He is the kind of guy who wears expensive loafers without socks, unbuttons his designer dress shirts a little too low, and constantly strings together meaningless corporate buzzwords like synergy, blockchain optimization, and leveraging liquid assets to sound far smarter than he actually is. In reality, he is remarkably mediocre. He coasts by on unearned confidence and a flashy smile. But to my parents, Trent was the ultimate social trophy. They practically worshipped the ground he walked on, simply because he came from what they considered a country club pedigree. To Calvin and Patricia, having a white son-in-law from a supposedly wealthy suburban family was their golden ticket into the exclusive upper echelon circles they had been desperately trying to infiltrate for decades. The way my parents treated Trent was a sickening, infuriating contrast to how they treated my husband Jamal. Jamal is a hard-working, incredibly talented black man who built his culinary empire entirely from scratch. He works 14-hour days in a hot, demanding kitchen, managing a huge staff crafting innovative menus and running a highly profitable, tangible business that brings pure joy to people. But at family dinners, my parents would actively look right past him. They would casually call his career unimpressive. My mother once introduced Jamal to her wealthy charity board members as just a local cook, completely erasing the fact that he was the owner and executive chef of a Michelin-recognized establishment. They looked down on his honest, grueling labor because it did not come wrapped in a trust fund or a golf course membership. I remember a specific Sunday dinner shortly after Imani and Trent got married. Jamal and I were sitting at the long mahogany dining table quietly eating our meal while Trent held court at the head of the table. He was swirling a glass of expensive imported wine that my father had eagerly opened just for him, loudly bragging about a cryptocurrency startup he was allegedly advising. He then had the absolute audacity to turn to Jamal and offer unsolicited, condescending business advice. Trent smirked and told my husband that restaurants were a terrible return on investment, a poor man's hustle, and that Jamal needed to learn how to let the market work for him instead of slaving over a hot stove. My blood boiled. I opened my mouth to tear into him and defend my husband, but before I could get a single word out, my father chimed in, nodding eagerly at Trent's empty, arrogant words. My father looked right at Jamal and told him he should really take notes from Trent, because Trent truly understood high-level finance and generational wealth. It was absolutely infuriating. They never saw the value in black excellence built from sweat, grit, and late nights. They only saw value in the proximity to white wealth and the illusion of corporate prestige. They dismissed my complex cybersecurity consulting firm as just doing IT support, and they treated my brilliant husband like hired help. We were constantly belittled, constantly compared to the golden couple, and constantly pushed to the margins of their picture-perfect family portrait. They thought we would just keep our heads down, bite our tongues, and take their disrespect forever because that is what families are supposed to do. They severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with, and they were completely blind to the massive, untouchable empire Jamal and I were quietly building in the shadows while they wasted their lives pretending to be rich. When Jamal finally proposed, it was the easiest yes of my entire life. We did not want a massive, gaudy spectacle. We wanted a genuine celebration of our love, surrounded by people who actually supported us. Because my parents had always used money as a leash to control my sister Jamal, and I made a hard rule right from the beginning. We were paying for every single detail of this wedding ourselves in cash. We did not ask my parents for a single dime. We wanted our wedding day to be entirely ours, free from their toxic strings and high society conditions. We booked a breathtaking historic botanical garden just outside the city. It was lush, intimate, and deeply romantic. We hired a phenomenal local black-owned catering company to collaborate with Jamal on a custom soulful menu that celebrated our heritage. We invited 80 of our closest friends and chosen family. It was shaping up to be the exact day we had dreamed of. But the moment I handed my parents their formal invitation, the relentless complaints began. Instead of being happy for her eldest daughter, my mother took one look at the embossed cardstock and sighed heavily. She immediately asked why we were not hosting the reception at the Piedmont Country Club, the exact same sterile, ridiculously expensive venue where Imani and Trent had gotten married 2 years prior. I calmly explained that the botanical garden felt more like us. Patricia scoffed, crossing her arms, and bluntly asked how she was supposed to invite the major donors from her foundation to a garden party. She told me that 80 guests was embarrassingly small. She said a wedding was not just about the bride and groom, but an essential networking opportunity for the family brand. She actually had the nerve to ask if we could move the venue last minute because her wealthy friends expected a certain level of prestige that a nature reserve simply could not provide. My father was not any better. Calvin spent weeks complaining about the menu. He told me that serving upscale Southern fusion was not refined enough for the caliber of people they associated with. He continuously tried to pressure me into hiring the same bland, overpriced French catering company Trent had used, completely disregarding the fact that my soon-to-be husband was an executive chef who had poured his heart into designing a menu that meant the world to us. They treated my wedding like it was a poorly planned backyard barbecue that was actively going to ruin their social standing in Atlanta. Trent, of course, could not resist inserting his unsolicited opinions into the mix. During one particularly exhausting Sunday dinner, he leaned back in his chair and offered to call in a favor with a country club manager he supposedly knew. He told Jamal and me that we were making a huge mistake by not leveraging our wedding as a networking event. He even offered to pay for a champagne fountain, but only if we allowed him to invite 10 of his prospective clients. When Jamal politely but firmly told Trent that our wedding was a private celebration of our relationship and not a marketing mixer for his wealth management firm, my parents looked at Jamal like he had just committed a crime. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls, and told Jamal he was being incredibly ungrateful for turning down such a generous, high-class offer from Trent. Despite their endless complaints, Calvin and Patricia promised they would be there. They assured me they would show up, but they made sure I felt guilty about it every single day leading up to the ceremony. And then there was my sister Imani. Because the spotlight was off her for 5 minutes, she made the entire wedding planning process an absolute nightmare. I had reluctantly asked Imani to be a bridesmaid, hoping that maybe for once we could share a sisterly bond. That was a massive mistake. She complained about the color of the dresses, claiming emerald green washed out her complexion. She complained about the rehearsal schedule, whining that it interfered with her weekly Pilates class and her standing brunch dates with Trent's wealthy friends. Every single time I tried to talk to her about floral arrangements or seating charts, she would instantly pivot the conversation back to herself. She would go on and on about how Trent was closing some massive phantom deal, or how they were shopping for a second vacation home, constantly trying to overshadow my milestone with her fabricated materialistic victories. The only person who kept me from losing my mind during those months was my father's older sister, Aunt Vivian. Aunt Vivian was a retired school principal, a fierce, no-nonsense woman who saw right through my parents and their desperate climbing. She was the only one who ever called Calvin and Patricia out on their behavior. When my mother complained about the botanical garden for the 100th time, Aunt Vivian slammed her coffee mug down on the table and told Patricia to stop acting like she was royalty just because she ran a charity. Aunt Vivian told me my plans were beautiful and that Jamal was the best thing that had ever happened to this family. She was my anchor, while the rest of my blood relatives acted like a storm trying to sink my ship. The tension steadily boiled over as the weeks counted down. Every family dinner turned into a battleground where my parents and sister would dissect my wedding plans and highlight everything they thought was wrong with it. They would ask why Jamal was not wearing a traditional tuxedo, why we were not hiring a 10-piece orchestra, or why we were not taking out loans to make the event look more expensive. I bit my tongue so many times I could taste blood. I kept telling myself that it was just stress, that eventually they would realize this was my special day and they would put their egos aside to celebrate their daughter. I spent hours finalizing the timeline, coordinating with vendors, and making sure my parents had prime seating for the ceremony. I even arranged for a private luxury car to pick them up so they would not have to worry about driving. I bent over backwards trying to accommodate their ridiculous comfort levels, desperately hoping that if I just made it easy enough for them, they would finally show up and act like a real family. As the wedding date grew closer, the excuses and the passive-aggressive comments from my parents multiplied. They started complaining that the wedding was taking up too much of their precious time. Patricia would call me during my work hours to complain that finding a dress for a garden wedding was impossible and that she felt completely uninspired by the event. Imani would send me messages saying she might have to leave the reception early because she and Trent had a very important dinner reservation they could not miss. I was bending until I was nearly breaking. I wanted to scream, but I kept the peace. I kept believing that when the day actually arrived, the petty complaints would fade away and they would realize the gravity of the moment. I thought the love of family would override their obsession with status. My parents and Imani were never focused on me. They were only focused on their social calendars. They were only concerned with how my life reflected on them. And because my beautiful debt-free wedding did not feature an exclusive guest list of Atlanta politicians and trust fund babies, they viewed it as a chore they were being forced to endure. I ignored the red flags. I brushed off their disdain because a naive part of my heart still wanted my parents to watch me walk down the aisle. I had absolutely no idea that their complaints were just the warm-up act for the ultimate betrayal. The Wednesday evening before my Saturday wedding, I was sitting on my living room floor surrounded by hand-tied floral ribbons and custom seating charts. Jamal was at his restaurant, running a final tasting menu with his sous chefs. I was exhausted, but radiating pure joy, carefully placing my parents' names at the head table. That was the exact moment my phone lit up with a notification from our family group chat. The message was from Trent. Trent casually announced that he had just secured a luxury rooftop lounge downtown for an exclusive investor networking gala for his wealth management firm. He boasted that several Fortune 500 executives and the mayor's chief of staff had just confirmed their attendance. He called it a massive breakthrough for his company. Then I looked at the date and time he had finalized for this monumental event. It was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The exact date and the exact hour I was scheduled to walk down the aisle. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited for my parents to reply and correct him. I waited for my mother to say, "Trent, you must have made a mistake. That is Kendra's wedding day." Instead, Patricia replied with a barrage of celebratory emojis. She immediately asked Trent for the VIP guest list so she could prepare elevator pitches for her nonprofit foundation. Imani chimed in right after complaining that she needed to buy a new designer dress on such short notice, but praising her husband for being such a financial visionary. Trent replied, saying it was a huge opportunity for the family brand to solidify their status in the city. Not a single one of them mentioned my wedding. My phone rang 2 minutes later. It was Patricia. I answered the call fully expecting her to finally address the glaring massive conflict and tell me that Trent was trying to reschedule. She did address it, but not in the way any normal mother would. She did not apologize. She did not sound stressed. She spoke in her most patronizing, sickly sweet voice, the one she usually reserved for gala donors. She told me we had a tiny scheduling conflict and that she needed me to be a team player for the family. I asked her exactly what she meant by that. She actually had the absolute audacity to tell me to push my wedding back. She said just move the ceremony to Sunday, Kendra, or maybe next month. The botanical garden is just trees, they can surely accommodate a minor shift. I was completely speechless. The room started spinning. I reminded my mother that vendors, caterers, and 80 guests had already booked flights and hotels. I told her you cannot just reschedule a wedding 3 days out because your son-in-law decided to throw a last-minute cocktail party. Calvin got on the line then. He used his booming, authoritative pastor-like voice, treating me like a disobedient child rather than a grown woman getting married. He told me I was not seeing the bigger picture. He said Trent's gala was a once-in-a-lifetime networking opportunity that could secure millions in funding for their foundation. My own father actually formed the words, "Your wedding is just a party, Kendra, but Trent is building generational wealth. You need to stop being so rigid and support the family legacy." I felt all the air leave my lungs. My father had just reduced the most important day of my life to a meaningless party that was getting in the way of his social climbing. I told them, no, Absolutely not. The wedding is happening on Saturday at 2 o'clock, and I told them to make Trent move his event. Imani snatched the phone from my parents. She started yelling at me, calling me a selfish, bitter older sister. She claimed Trent had been working on this deal for weeks and could not control the venue's sudden availability. She accused me of trying to sabotage her husband's success because I was jealous that Jamal was just a cook while Trent was a corporate powerhouse. The sheer, unapologetic disrespect was suffocating. I snapped back. I told my sister that Jamal is an executive chef who actually works for a living, unlike Trent, who just talks in circles and plays with other people's money. Patricia gasped loudly into the receiver. She asked how dare I disrespect Trent after he brought so much prestige to our family. Then she gave me a cold, hard ultimatum. Patricia said if I was not willing to delay my ceremony to accommodate the family's vital business interests, then the family could not possibly attend my wedding. She said they were required to be at Trent's gala to secure their donor connections. They could not afford to miss out on high society networking just to watch me get married in a garden. She told me that by refusing to bend to their schedule, I was proving how unsupportive and selfish I truly was. I sat there on my living room floor in absolute silence. My own mother was telling me she would skip my wedding for a networking mixer. I asked her point blank, making sure there was no misunderstanding. I said, "Are you telling me you are not coming to my wedding?" She did not even hesitate. She said, "You are making this choice, Kendra. You are choosing to be difficult and stubborn. We will not be there." Calvin chimed in one last time, telling me he was deeply disappointed in my lack of maturity. He told me that when I was ready to apologize to Trent and be a team player, they could talk again. Then they hung up. The line went completely dead. 3 days before my wedding, the most important day of my life, my parents and my only sister officially pulled out. Not because of a medical emergency, not because of an unavoidable family crisis, but because my white brother-in-law booked a networking event and my parents desperately wanted to rub shoulders with rich people to validate their own empty existence. The horrific reality crashed over me all at once. I was sitting alone, surrounded by the beautiful details of a day they were supposed to share with me. I reached over and grabbed a thick black permanent marker. I pulled the custom seating chart toward me and found the head table. I crossed out Calvin. I crossed out Patricia. I crossed out Imani. I crossed out Trent. I drew a harsh, jagged line right through their names, pressing so hard the ink bled through the heavy cardstock. My hands were shaking violently, hot tears of absolute betrayal spilling down my face. I realized in that quiet, devastating moment that I have never truly had a family. I only had people who shared my DNA but treated me like an inconvenient business transaction they could cancel whenever a better offer came along. When Saturday morning arrived, the Atlanta sky was a brilliant, flawless blue. The botanical garden we had booked looked like a scene pulled straight from a fairy tale. Vibrant magnolias, climbing ivy, and perfectly manicured pathways created a lush, romantic sanctuary. Jamal and I had poured our souls into planning every single detail. His family arrived early, bringing with them a tidal wave of loud, genuine joy. His mother came rushing into my bridal suite, her eyes shining with happy tears as she wrapped her arms tightly around me. She told me how beautiful I looked and how proud she was to officially welcome me into their family. The sheer warmth radiating from Jamal's relatives was overwhelming, but it also served as a painful, glaring reminder of the freezing void on my side of the room. As I sat in the velvet chair, having my hair and makeup finalized, my eyes kept darting to my phone resting on the vanity. I was clinging to a pathetic, irrational sliver of hope. I thought that maybe, just maybe, my parents would wake up this morning, realize they were about to miss their eldest daughter's wedding, and rush over. I thought surely the undeniable weight of a lifetime milestone would snap them out of their toxic social climbing, but my screen remained entirely blank. Not a single text message. Not a single missed call. The silence was deafening. Then came a soft knock at the bridal suite door. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The door swung open, but it was not my mother. It was Aunt Vivian. She stood there looking regal in a deep plum dress, her posture straight, and her expression a mixture of fierce love and profound sorrow. She was the only person from my bloodline who possessed the courage to defy my parents' social mandates. I stood up the heavy layers of my wedding dress, rustling around my ankles, and the moment I saw the profound understanding in my aunt's eyes, the dam finally broke. Aunt Vivian crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled me into a fierce, grounding embrace. I collapsed against her shoulder and wept. I sobbed for the little girl who had spent her entire childhood trying to earn a single scrap of unconditional love. I cried for the woman who had bent over backwards to accommodate a family that viewed her as nothing more than a disposable inconvenience. Aunt Vivian held me tight, rubbing my back while I shook. She did not offer empty platitudes or tell me that they meant well. She simply held space for my grief. When I finally pulled back, she wiped a stray tear from my cheek and looked me dead in the eye. She told me that some people are so consumed by their own illusions of grandeur that they become blind to the real treasures in their lives. She told me not to let their brokenness dictate my worth, and she promised that I was stepping into a new family today, one that actually knew how to love. With my makeup carefully retouched and my shoulders squared, I linked my arm through Aunt Vivian's. Since my father had abandoned his duty to walk me down the aisle for a rooftop networking mixer, my aunt proudly took on the honor. The heavy wooden doors of the garden pavilion swung open. The string quartet began playing a soulful acoustic arrangement of my favorite song. The afternoon sun filtered through the massive oak trees, casting a warm golden glow over the 80 guests who had gathered to celebrate us. I stepped forward, trying to focus entirely on Jamal waiting for me at the altar. He looked incredibly handsome in his custom-tailored suit, his eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears of pure adoration. But as I walked down the aisle, my peripheral vision caught the devastating reality on the left side of the aisle. Right at the very front, cordoned off by silk ribbons, were 5 empty seats. The seats reserved for Calvin, Patricia, Imani, Trent, and the +1 they had demanded. 5 glaring vacant spaces that screamed their rejection to everyone in attendance. It felt like a physical blow to my chest. It was a public display of my family's abandonment. But then I looked back at Jamal. I saw the steady, unwavering devotion in his face. I squeezed Aunt Vivian's arm, lifted my chin, and walked past those empty seats without dropping a single tear. The ceremony was profoundly beautiful. We exchanged vows we had written ourselves, promising to protect each other, to build a life founded on mutual respect, and to be the safe harbor we both deserved. The reception that followed was a magnificent triumph. Jamal's custom menu was a masterpiece of culinary art, the music kept the dance floor packed all night, and the room echoed with genuine laughter. I smiled, I danced, and I celebrated the beginning of my new life. But beneath the joy, the phantom pain of my family's absence lingered like a dull ache in my bones. Late that night, after the final guests had departed and the last toast was made, Jamal and I returned to our hotel suite in the city. He wrapped his arms around me from behind as I stood on the balcony, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. He kissed my shoulder and softly told me how proud he was of my strength today. I smiled at him, kissed his cheek, and told him I just needed a minute to change out of my dress. I walked into the bedroom, unzipped my gown, and sat on the edge of the mattress. I reached over to the nightstand and picked up my phone. I unlocked the screen. Still no messages from my mother. Still no missed calls from my father or my sister. Instead, the algorithm presented me with an update on my social media feed. It was a post from Imani, a carousel of highly filtered photos from Trent's exclusive networking gala. There was my father holding a glass of champagne and laughing with a local politician. There was my mother draped in a designer gown, posing arm in arm with Trent against the backdrop of the city skyline. The caption read, "Building generational wealth and celebrating family legacy with the best team." They looked perfectly happy. They looked completely unbothered by the fact that they had missed my wedding. They were actively celebrating their social climbing while I was sitting in my hotel room in my wedding dress. In that quiet, dimly lit room, the last remaining thread of naive hope I had been holding on to completely snapped. The grief I had carried all day instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute clarity. The hurt was gone. In its place was a rational, unshakable resolution. I realized that begging for love from people who view you as a liability is a spectacular waste of a life. I opened my phone settings. I went straight to my contacts. I clicked on my mother's name, scrolled to the bottom of her profile, and hit block. I did the same for my father. I repeated the process for Imani and then for Trent. I unfollowed them on every single social media platform. I silenced their notifications. I severed the digital cords that kept me tethered to their toxic approval. I made a vow to myself right then and there. I would never again shrink my ambitions to make them comfortable. I would never again attend their forced holiday dinners where they paraded Trent around like a trophy while ignoring my husband's culinary brilliance. I would never again answer their calls or subject myself to their manipulative ultimatums. I was entirely done. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand, letting go of the heavy, suffocating burden of the family I was born into. I walked back out to the balcony, took my husband's hand, and stepped fully into the family I had chosen, ready to build my empire in absolute silence. The first few weeks of absolute silence were the hardest. I did not miss the insults, the passive-aggressive remarks, or the constant anxiety of walking on eggshells. What I missed was the illusion of the family I had always desperately wanted, but never actually had. Unlearning 30 years of toxic conditioning took time. Whenever a holiday or a family member's birthday rolled around, I felt that familiar phantom guilt creeping up my spine. But every single time I looked at my phone and saw 0 blocked voicemails and 0 attempts from them to reach out and apologize, that guilt instantly evaporated. They did not care that I was gone. They were probably relieved that they no longer had to pretend to respect me or my husband. So I took that rejection, packed it down tight, and used it as high-octane fuel. 2 entire years passed in a blur of relentless, beautiful grind. Waking up on Sunday mornings used to fill me with a heavy, suffocating dread. I used to spend hours mentally preparing myself for the inevitable interrogations at my parents' dining table. I would brace myself for my mother's backhanded compliments about my hair or my clothes and my father's dismissive sighs whenever I tried to talk about my business. But during those 2 years of no contact, Sundays transformed into a sanctuary. Jamal and I would wake up late, listen to old soul records, and drink coffee on our back porch. My phone was blissfully quiet. There were no manipulative text messages demanding my presence at some arbitrary charity mixer. There were no frantic phone calls from Imani demanding I drop everything to solve a crisis she created. The silence was not empty at all. It was incredibly full of healing. I poured every single ounce of my pain, my frustration, and my absolute refusal to be mediocre directly into my cybersecurity firm. I stopped taking on small local contracts and locked myself in my home office for months. I spent 14-hour days staring at walls of code fueled by black coffee and sheer determination. I was developing a highly advanced proprietary data encryption algorithm. It was a predictive security architecture designed to identify and neutralize zero-day cyber threats before they could ever breach a corporate network. It was incredibly complex, the kind of software that major financial institutions and government contractors desperately needed to protect their highly sensitive data. The patent process itself was an absolute administrative nightmare. It required endless meetings with intellectual property lawyers, relentless security audits, and proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my algorithm was entirely unique. There were days when I wanted to scream in frustration, days when the code simply refused to compile correctly, and days when the ghost of imposter syndrome tried to creep back in. But I refused to quit. I remembered the 5 empty seats at my wedding, and I sat right back down at my keyboard. I channeled all the times my father called my career a quiet hobby, and all the times Trent smugly talked down to me about high-level finance into every single line of code I wrote. I was not just building software, I was building an impenetrable fortress for my future. While I was busy constructing digital walls, Jamal was actively revolutionizing the culinary scene in Atlanta. We became an unstoppable two-person ecosystem of ambition. When I was pulling all-nighters at my desk, Jamal would quietly walk into my office at 2 in the morning, setting down a plate of perfectly seared scallops or truffle-infused macaroni and cheese, kissing the top of my head before heading to bed. And when he was exhausted from managing inventory and back-to-back dinner services, I was the one massaging his shoulders and managing his restaurant's payroll spreadsheets. We did not have a wealthy family writing us blank checks. We did not have elite country club connections feeding us investors. We only had our own sweat, our own grit, and our unwavering belief in each other, and it paid off in ways that defied imagination. Jamal's upscale soul food fusion restaurant exploded in popularity. Word of mouth spread like wildfire, and soon his establishment was the hardest reservation to get in the entire city. Professional athletes, touring musicians, and legitimate politicians were waiting months just to taste his menu. But the ultimate validation arrived during the second year of our silence. The Michelin Guide officially expanded its coverage into our city, and Jamal received a highly coveted Michelin star nod. The man my parents had brutally dismissed as just a local cook was suddenly being recognized on a global culinary stage. His face was featured in prestigious food magazines, praised for elevating Southern cuisine with unmatched innovation and grace. I wept tears of pure pride the night he brought that recognition home. Meanwhile, my own massive breakthrough finally arrived. After nearly 2 years of rigorous testing, debugging, and navigating a labyrinth of legal paperwork, my proprietary data encryption software was officially patented. I held that thick certified government document in my hands and felt a profound sense of vindication. I owned the exclusive rights to a piece of technology that was about to disrupt the entire cybersecurity industry. We were thriving in absolute beautiful silence. We did not post our daily achievements on social media for validation. We did not seek the approval of Atlanta's fake high society. We were completely removed from my family's toxic orbit, floating in a peaceful universe of our own making. Sometimes late at night, I would wonder what Calvin, Patricia, Imani, and Trent were doing. I imagined them still putting on their exhausting performances, dressing up in clothes they probably could not afford, attending endless networking galas to impress people who did not actually care about them. I imagined Trent still swilling expensive wine and using corporate buzzwords to mask his lack of actual tangible skills. But those thoughts were fleeting, quickly replaced by the tangible, joyful reality of the life Jamal and I were living. We had successfully broken the cycle. We had proven that true wealth is not about who you know or what neighborhood you live in. True wealth is peace of mind, a loving partner, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you built your empire with your own 2 bare hands. We were happy, secure, and completely unbothered. I had no intention of ever crossing paths with my family again. But the universe has a very funny way of forcing you to confront your past, especially when you are about to secure the kind of victory that makes you completely untouchable. When my patent was finalized, the industry shifted. My software was doing things that billion-dollar corporations were spending decades trying to figure out. Within 3 months, the offers started pouring in. At first, it was just aggressive venture capital firms wanting equity, trying to lowball me because they saw a Black woman working out of her home office and assumed I did not know my own value. But I had spent 30 years surviving Calvin and Patricia. I knew exactly how to spot a manipulator, and I knew how to say no. Then the major players arrived. I am talking about top-tier multinational tech conglomerates. They saw what I built, an impenetrable digital fortress, and they wanted it exclusively for their global infrastructure. I hired the best intellectual property lawyers in Atlanta, and we entered a brutal, intense negotiation phase that lasted for several grueling weeks. I sat across from rooms full of seasoned corporate executives, men in tailored suits who expected me to shrink under their pressure. But I held my absolute ground. I knew the architecture of my code, I knew its market value, and I refused to accept a single penny less than what I deserved. Finally, we reached an agreement. A massive corporate buyout. When my lead attorney slid the final contract across the polished mahogany table, my hand did not shake. I signed my name transferring the proprietary rights of my software to the conglomerate. In exchange, I secured a payout that was quite frankly staggering. It was generational wealth, the kind of money that changes your entire bloodline and rewrites your future forever. 48 hours later, Jamal and I were sitting on our living room couch staring at my laptop screen. We watched as the wire transfer cleared. I refreshed the banking portal 3 separate times just to make sure it was not a glitch or a system error. A long string of zeros stretched across the screen, a number so extraordinarily large it felt surreal. We had become wealthy beyond our wildest imagination. Jamal pulled me into his arms, and we just sat there in the quiet of our home, letting the immense gravity of the moment wash over us. There was no screaming, no popping champagne just yet. It was just a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. The grind had actually paid off. The feeling of true financial freedom is incredibly difficult to describe until you experience it firsthand. It is not about buying flashy things or throwing cash around for attention. It is the absolute beautiful absence of panic. It is knowing that if the roof leaks, you just fix it. If an emergency happens, you can afford the best care in the world. The very first thing I did was log into Jamal's business accounts. Without telling him, I paid off the remaining commercial loan on his restaurant. He owned his Michelin star establishment, completely outright free and clear of any bank's leverage. When I handed him the zero balance confirmation, the man who had worked 14-hour days in a sweltering kitchen to support my dreams broke down in tears. The second thing I did was drive across town to Aunt Vivian's house. I sat my fiercely loyal aunt down at her worn kitchen table, the same table where she used to feed me after school when my parents were too busy attending charity luncheons. I handed her a certified bank draft that would comfortably cover her retirement, her property taxes, and any future medical care she might ever need for the rest of her life. She wept, trying to push the paper back across the table, insisting it was too much. But I refused to take it back. I told her it was back pay for being the only person who actually showed up for me when I needed a mother figure, especially on my wedding day. Now, in a typical dramatic story, this is the exact part where the triumphant underdog marches back to their toxic family, kicks open the front door, and slams a bank statement on the dining room table to prove everyone wrong. I did not do that. I did not pick up the phone to call Patricia. I did not send an email to Calvin. I did not casually text Trent a screenshot of my investment portfolio to crush his fragile, unearned ego. I kept my mouth entirely shut. I knew that reaching out to gloat would only pull me right back into the miserable, exhausting game they had been playing my entire life. They operated on jealousy, competition, and spite. I had completely transcended that. I did not need to rub my success in their faces, because my success was for me, not for them. Gloating would mean that I still craved their validation, that I still needed them to see me as worthy. But I did not care what they thought of me anymore. Their opinions held zero currency in my world. I was simply too busy living a beautiful, abundant life. Jamal, Aunt Vivian, and I celebrated privately. We booked a quiet, luxurious trip to the Amalfi Coast, ate incredible food overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, and toasted to our bright future. We enjoyed our success wrapped in the safety of people who actually loved each other. I was perfectly content being a ghost to my parents, living quietly in my own peaceful paradise. I thought I had safely closed the door on my past forever, but I was about to learn that quiet wealth only stays quiet until you decide to treat yourself to something loud. For 2 years, Jamal and I lived well below our means, even after the massive corporate buyout. We invested heavily, secured our financial portfolios, and made absolutely certain that our foundation was completely crack-proof. I was not interested in flashy designer labels or buying a massive mansion with 20 empty rooms just to impress strangers I did not care about. But there was exactly one indulgence I had promised myself during those long, grueling nights of writing code. I had a vision that kept me awake when my eyes were burning and my hands were cramping from typing. I wanted a Porsche Panamera. It was not about seeking validation or trying to look rich. As a software engineer, I deeply respected the absolute precision, the flawless mechanics, and the quiet, undeniable power of that machine. So on a bright Tuesday morning, I walked into the highest-end luxury car dealership in Atlanta. I was wearing a simple pair of jeans, a comfortable oversized sweater, and my natural hair was pulled back into a neat bun. I did not look like their typical high-rolling clientele. A salesman approached me with that familiar, slightly condescending customer service smile, clearly expecting me to ask for directions to the nearest coffee shop, or maybe ask to take a quick photo next to a car I could never afford. I walked straight past him, heading directly toward a stunning midnight blue Porsche Panamera, sitting right in the center of the pristine showroom floor. It had a custom cream leather interior and every single upgraded feature available on the market. I turned to the salesman, looked him dead in the eye, and told him I wanted the keys. He blinked, stammering slightly, and tried to politely ask if I wanted to sit down in his office to discuss financing options or run a preliminary credit check first. I opened my leather bag, pulled out a certified cashier's check for $140,000, and placed it right on his glass desk. The look of absolute staggering shock on his face was worth every single penny. I bought my absolute dream car in full right there on the spot without a single monthly payment or a bank loan to my name. Driving that magnificent machine off the lot was a spiritual experience. The engine purred with a deep, effortless power. When I pulled up to the valet stand outside of Jamal's restaurant later that afternoon, my husband actually dropped the inventory clipboard he was holding. He ran outside his chef's coat, bright white in the midday sun, and scooped me up in a massive hug right there on the sidewalk. He spun me around, laughing loudly, celebrating my victory just as hard as I had celebrated his Michelin star nod. We decided to take the car for a long, scenic drive up through the mountains that following Saturday. When we stopped at a breathtaking overlook, the late afternoon sun was casting this perfect golden light across the sleek hood of the midnight blue Porsche. Jamal pulled out his phone. He told me to lean against the driver's side door and just look at him. I did not strike some rigid, unnatural pose. I just leaned back against the cool metal, crossed my arms, and smiled a genuine, radiant smile at the man I loved. Jamal snapped a picture. When I looked at the photo on his screen, I felt a deep, overwhelming surge of pride. We looked like exactly what we were. Two successful, deeply in love, completely unbothered Black professionals standing next to a highly expensive, fully owned asset. There were no flashy logos screaming for attention. There were no location tags trying to prove we belonged in an exclusive area. It was just raw, undeniable success. I airdropped the photo to my own phone. I had not posted anything on my social media accounts in almost 8 months. My page was incredibly boring by Atlanta society standards. It was mostly just pictures of Jamal's culinary creations or a few beautiful landscapes from our overseas trips. I did not use my platform to brag or project a fake lifestyle to gain followers. But this moment felt different. I wanted to document this milestone for myself as a digital timestamp of the exact moment I fully realized my own power. I opened the Instagram app. I uploaded the photo of me leaning against the $140,000 Porsche. I did not tag the luxury dealership. I did not mention the corporate buyout or the millions sitting in my bank accounts. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph about overcoming my family's toxic behavior. I kept it incredibly simple. I typed 4 words into the caption. Hard work pays off. I added a single blue heart emoji and hit share. Now I knew exactly how my sister operated. Imani had always been pathologically obsessed with social media. During the 2 years we were estranged, I had noticed a very specific, undeniable pattern. Whenever I posted an Instagram story, usually just a picture of my morning coffee or a view from a hiking trail, there was always a strange blank account with 0 followers and 0 posts viewing my content within minutes. I knew it was Imani. Toxic people can never truly let you go. They need to monitor you from the shadows, desperately hoping to see you fail so they can feel better about their own miserable lives. They create burner accounts to stalk your progress because their fragile egos cannot handle the idea that you might actually be surviving without them. I knew she was watching, but I honestly did not care. I did not post the picture of the Porsche as bait. I did not post it to trigger a reaction from the people who had abandoned me at the altar. I posted it because I had earned the right to be proud of the life I had built from scratch. I tossed my phone onto the kitchen counter, turned around and went to the cabinet to pull out a bottle of wine. I started gathering fresh ingredients to cook a quiet, relaxing dinner at home with my husband. I was completely at peace, blissfully unaware of the absolute chaos that picture was currently causing across town. The digital trap had been unknowingly set, and the starving, status-obsessed wolves that I used to call my family had just caught the scent of fresh wealth. I expected my evening to end with a home-cooked meal and a movie. I did not anticipate that the fortress of silence I had built for 2 years was about to be violently breached. I had just finished pouring a glass of crisp white wine and was expertly dicing a bell pepper on my cutting board when the pristine silence of my kitchen was shattered. My phone, which was sitting face up on the marble island, began to violently vibrate against the stone surface. I glanced over at the screen, expecting to see a text from Jamal confirming what time he would be leaving the restaurant. Instead, the name flashing across the bright screen caused my breath to hitch in my throat. It was my mother. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. It had been exactly 14 minutes since I tapped the share button on that Instagram post. 14 minutes. 2 entire years, 24 full months, 730 days of absolute deafening silence. They did not call on my birthdays. They did not call to check if I survived flu season. They did not call on my first wedding anniversary. But it took exactly 14 minutes for a photo of a midnight blue Porsche Panamera to magically resurrect my mother's maternal instincts. I did not answer. I stood there, the chef's knife hovering over the cutting board, and just watched the screen light up the kitchen. The call went to voicemail. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just a fluke. But 5 seconds later, the phone started vibrating again. I let it ring out. Then it rang a third time, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. 6 back-to-back phone calls in rapid succession. This was not a casual check-in. This was a frantic, desperate emergency born out of pure, unadulterated greed. They were panicking. By the 6th ring, an icy, sharp wave of amusement washed over me. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear exactly how my mother was going to attempt to bridge a 2-year gap of brutal abandonment simply because she smelled money. I set the knife down, wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, picked up the device, and tapped the green accept button. I brought the phone to my ear but did not say a single word. "Kendra, my beautiful, brilliant girl," Patricia cooed into the receiver. Her voice was drenched in this sickeningly fake, sugary sweetness that physically made my stomach turn. It was the exact same high-pitched, highly curated tone she used when she was sweet-talking wealthy donors at her foundation galas. "We have missed you so incredibly much, sweetheart." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of this woman was staggering. My beautiful girl. The last time I heard her voice, she was calling me stubborn, selfish, and rigid because I refused to cancel my wedding day for Trent's networking cocktail hour. And now she was speaking to me as if I had just returned from a long, successful vacation. She was acting as if the 5 empty chairs in the front row of my wedding ceremony had never existed. She was acting as if she had not completely thrown me away the moment she realized I was not serving her social climbing agenda. I kept my voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. I asked her what she wanted. Patricia let out a forced, airy laugh, trying to play off my coldness. "Oh, do not be so silly, Kendra. A mother does not need a reason to call her eldest daughter. Your father and I were just sitting in our living room talking about how much we miss your face around the house. We feel terrible that we let so much time slip away from us. You know how crazy the foundation work gets? It just consumes our schedules. But family is what truly matters." She paused for a fraction of a second, and then she casually dropped the bait. "Imani was actually just showing us that little post you made online today. It looks like you and Jamal are doing all right for yourselves. A new car is always a fun little treat. It is so nice to see you getting out of the house." A fun little treat. She could not even compliment me without trying to minimize the achievement. She was desperately trying to sound nonchalant, but I could hear the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. I could picture her pacing the floor of her heavily mortgaged living room, her eyes wide with panic and calculation. She realized that the daughter she discarded was now sitting in a higher tax bracket than her precious country club son-in-law. Anyway, Patricia continued, her voice tightening with an urgent, commanding authority she could not quite hide. Calvin and I have decided that 2 years is simply too long for a family to be apart. We need to fix this silly little rift between us. We are hosting a mandatory family meeting tomorrow evening at our house. Imani and Trent will be there. We are ordering dinner from that upscale steakhouse you used to love. We expect you to be there at 6 o'clock sharp so we can reconnect and catch up on everything we have missed. A mandatory family meeting, not a heartfelt apology, not a tearful confession of regret for abandoning me at the altar. Just a swift, commanding summons to their estate, complete with the promise of expensive takeout, as if a steak could magically erase 24 months of profound trauma. She wanted me back in their orbit immediately. The urgency in her voice was not driven by love. It was driven by an absolute desperation to figure out exactly how much money I had and how quickly they could get their hands on it to boost their own failing social status. The old Kendra, the girl who desperately craved her parents' approval, would have hung up the phone in tears. She would have yelled, screamed, and demanded an apology. But the new Kendra, the woman who had just sold a proprietary data encryption algorithm for generational wealth, saw a perfect opportunity. I realized in that exact moment that they were handing me the keys to their own destruction. They wanted to invite me into their home to size me up. They wanted to evaluate my assets. I let the silence hang on the line for a few agonizing seconds, making Patricia sweat. Then I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile to an empty kitchen. 6 o'clock, I said evenly. I will be there. Oh, wonderful. Patricia gasped, the profound relief completely obvious in her breathless response. We are so thrilled, Kendra. We cannot wait to hear all about what you have been doing. See you tomorrow, sweetheart. The line clicked dead. I set the device back onto the marble island. I picked up the chef's knife and resumed dicing the bell pepper. The rhythmic sound of the blade hitting the wood was the only noise in the room. I did not feel sad. I did not feel manipulated. I felt an intense, overwhelming clarity. The audacity they possessed to summon me like an employee, rather than a daughter, they had profoundly wronged, was breathtaking. Patricia actually believed she could simply snap her fingers and reel me back in. She believed I was still the invisible, obedient tech nerd who would blindly hand over whatever resources they demanded to maintain the family image. They had absolutely no idea that I was not the same woman they threw away 2 years ago. I was not walking into a heartfelt family reunion. I was walking into a war zone, and I needed to be armed with far more than just a newly purchased sports car. I finished preparing dinner just as Jamal walked through the front door. He took one look at my face and knew the atmosphere in our home had shifted. I told him about the phone call. I told him about the 14 minutes it took for my mother to remember she had an eldest daughter after 2 years of complete silence. Jamal did not tell me to forgive and forget. He did not tell me to be the bigger person or try to mend fences. My husband simply kissed my forehead, handed me a fresh cup of coffee, and told me to do what I do best. He told me to go hunting. I walked down the hall and unlocked the door to my home office. This room was my sanctuary. It housed 3 massive curved monitors, a custom-built processing rig, and layers of encrypted servers. People like my parents and Trent assumed that hacking or cybersecurity was just guessing passwords in a dark room, like a scene from a bad movie. They did not understand that people leave massive, glowing digital footprints everywhere they go. You do not need to break the law to find a person's darkest secrets. You just need to know exactly which public databases to query, which tax records to cross-reference, and how to read the breadcrumbs they carelessly leave behind. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, cracked my knuckles, and went to work. My first target was Trent. For years, he had sat at my parents' dining table swirling expensive wine and bragging about his elite wealth management firm. He acted like he was managing portfolios for billionaires and moving markets with a single phone call. I started by pulling the basic state corporate registry filings for his business. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the original incorporation documentation. His firm was not some prestigious financial institution with decades of history and a polished corporate board. It was a limited liability company registered to a virtual mail drop address located above a strip mall dry cleaner. There was no physical office. There were no corporate headquarters. There was not even a dedicated business phone line. I dug deeper. I accessed the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority database, an entirely public record that lists the credentials, licensing, and disciplinary history of every legitimate broker in the country. Trent was listed, but his credentials were shockingly bare. He did not hold the advanced certifications or series licenses he constantly boasted about to my father. More importantly, his firm's assets under management were incredibly small. He was not handling millions of dollars for Atlanta's elite. According to the public filings, his firm barely managed enough capital to justify a single employee's minimum wage salary, let alone the lavish designer lifestyle he and Imani aggressively flaunted on social media. The math was completely broken. Trent and Imani were driving luxury SUVs, wearing tailored clothes, taking overseas vacations, and attending high society galas every single weekend. If his firm was bringing in such abysmal revenue, I needed to know exactly how they were funding their lifestyle. I started running advanced searches on county property records. I pulled the deed to the beautiful sprawling house Trent and Imani had supposedly purchased as their dream home. The records showed the house was not owned outright. It was heavily mortgaged, and interestingly, my parents' names were listed on the secondary loan documents as financial guarantors. Trent was not a self-made financial prodigy. He was a parasite living directly off my parents' credit limits. But that only answered half the equation. Where was the actual liquid cash coming from to sustain the daily illusion of wealth? I pivoted my monitors and brought up my parents' community nonprofit foundation. This was the crown jewel of Calvin and Patricia's entire social existence. They hosted massive charity galas, collecting generous donations from local politicians and wealthy business owners under the guise of funding youth education programs. As a registered nonprofit organization, their financial activities were legally required to be fully transparent to the public. I accessed the Internal Revenue Service database and downloaded the last 5 years of their Form 990 tax filings. Tax returns for nonprofits tell a very detailed, undeniable story if you know how to read the financial coding. I opened the downloaded documents and started scanning the revenue columns against the expenditure reports. At first glance, the foundation looked incredibly healthy. They were pulling in millions in charitable donations every single year. But when I scrolled down to the disbursement sections, the specific pages that detail exactly where those millions of dollars are actually going, my blood ran completely cold. A legitimate nonprofit spends the vast majority of its revenue on actual charitable programming and community outreach. Calvin and Patricia's foundation was spending an astronomical percentage of its incoming donations on administrative costs and vague external consulting fees. I isolated the line items for those consulting fees and began tracing the vendor names through the state business registry. I found a company called Apex Financial Solutions, receiving quarterly payments of $25,000 for alleged portfolio management services. I found another entity called Horizon Strategic Consulting, pulling in $40,000 a year for community outreach advisory. Neither of these companies had a digital footprint. Neither had a website, a staff, or a portfolio of previous work. I ran a reverse lookup on the registered agents for both of those shell companies. I matched the employer identification numbers and traced the incorporation documents back to their original source. The registered agent for Apex Financial Solutions was Trent. The primary beneficiary for Horizon Strategic Consulting was Trent. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors casting a harsh blue light across my quiet office. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. This was not just a case of my parents overstating their wealth to impress the neighbors. This was not just Trent exaggerating his success to secure his place as the golden son-in-law. This was a highly orchestrated, deeply illegal financial pipeline. My parents were taking tax-deductible charity donations, meant for underprivileged youth programs, and funneling massive undocumented sums of money directly into Trent's fake consulting companies to fund his and Imani's lavish lifestyle. I spent the next 4 hours pulling every single public record I could find to build a flawless, undeniable map of their corruption. I cross-referenced property tax records, vehicle registrations, and municipal court dockets. I treated my own blood relatives like a corporate threat assessment, completely detaching my emotions from the data. The deeper I went, the more the illusion of their untouchable Atlanta dynasty crumbled into digital dust. I traced the money flowing out of the foundation and watched it disappear into Trent's personal accounts. I saw the aggressive, high-risk trading platforms Trent was registered on. He was not managing wealth to build a family legacy. He was actively gambling away stolen charity funds. By 3 o'clock in the morning, my eyes were burning and my desk was covered in printed spreadsheets, highlighted tax forms, and corporate registry maps showing the exact flow of the embezzled money. Jamal walked quietly into the office holding a fresh mug of green tea. He set it down next to my keyboard and looked at the web of documents displayed across my screens. He did not need to ask if I found anything. He just looked at my face and saw the absolute calculating silence in my expression. They wanted me to come to a mandatory family meeting. They wanted to sit me down at their mahogany dining table, play the role of the loving, supportive parents, and figure out how to siphon my newly acquired tech wealth to patch the gaping holes in their sinking ship. They were bleeding money. Their son-in-law was a complete fraud, and my $140,000 Porsche was a beacon of rescue to people who were drowning in debt. I took a slow sip of the hot tea, my mind entirely focused. I was not just going to attend their little dinner, I was going to bring the receipts. The warm green tea Jamal left on my desk sat untouched as I dove back into the digital labyrinth. Finding the shell companies was just scratching the surface. I needed to understand exactly where those diverted charity funds were ending up and why my parents were suddenly so desperate for my presence. I pulled the routing numbers attached to Trent's fake consulting entities and cross-referenced them with public judgment records and civil court dockets. What I found made my stomach drop and my heart race with a chilling, absolute clarity. Trent was not just skimming a few $1,000s off the top to pay for Imani's designer handbags. He was running a full-blown, disastrously managed Ponzi scheme. Using his country club pedigree and his flashy smile, Trent had managed to convince several mid-tier Atlanta investors, mostly friends of my parents, to hand over their capital. He promised them astronomical returns through his wealth management firm. But Trent possessed absolutely no actual financial acumen. He took their initial investments and threw the money into incredibly aggressive, high-risk, offshore day trading platforms. He was gambling with other people's life savings, hoping to strike it rich and play the role of the Wall Street prodigy. When the market inevitably turned against him, Trent took massive losses. The brokerages hit him with devastating margin calls. A margin call means the bank is demanding immediate cash to cover your gambling debts, or they liquidate everything and take legal action. Trent panicked. He did not have the cash. He had already spent a huge portion of his investors' capital on his luxury cars, his lavish wedding to Imani, and his carefully curated high society image. To keep the illusion alive and pay back the early investors who were demanding their returns, Trent needed a massive influx of untraceable capital fast. That is where my parents' community nonprofit foundation became his personal piggy bank. I tracked the precise ledger entries. Trent had systematically embezzled over $300,000 directly from the charity's operational funds. He used his position as the golden son-in-law to convince Calvin and Patricia to give him unfettered access to the foundation's accounting software under the guise of optimizing their charitable assets. He then wired that $300,000 through his shell companies straight into his failing brokerage accounts to cover his margin calls and pay off his increasingly angry initial investors. But here's the truly sickening part. When Calvin and Patricia discovered the missing funds, they did not call the police. They did not report Trent for wire fraud. They did not drag him before the charity's board of directors and demand he be held accountable. They covered it up. They actively chose to protect their precious white son-in-law from a federal prison sentence because exposing him meant exposing their own profound stupidity. It meant admitting to their wealthy, elite social circle that the man they had paraded around town, the man they had chosen over their own daughter's wedding, was nothing but a cheap con artist. Exposing Trent would completely shatter the flawless high society facade they had spent their entire lives building. They could not bear the thought of the country club gossip. They could not handle the absolute humiliation of being swindled by the very man they constantly used to belittle my brilliant, hardworking black husband. So my parents did what desperate, image-obsessed people always do. They doubled down on the lie. I opened another search window and accessed the county property tax database. I pulled the historical deeds and lien records for my parents' sprawling gated estate. The screen populated with a barrage of recent financial activity that painted a picture of absolute suffocating desperation. To quietly replace the $300,000 Trent had stolen from the foundation, before the charity board noticed the missing funds, Calvin and Patricia had secretly taken out massive secondary mortgages on their home. They had leveraged every single ounce of equity they owned. Their pristine, luxurious mansion was currently drowning in predatory high-interest debt. But you cannot hide missing charity funds forever, no matter how many secondary mortgages you take out. The federal government does not care about your country club reputation. I ran a final query through a public legal database that tracks federal tax liens and audit notices. My eyes locked onto a freshly filed document dated just 3 weeks ago. The Internal Revenue Service and the State Attorney General had officially flagged my parents' nonprofit foundation for severe financial irregularities. They were facing an active, aggressive federal audit. Government forensic accountants were already demanding line-by-line justifications for the exorbitant consulting fees paid to Trent's shell companies. The walls were entirely closing in on them. If the federal auditors unraveled the paper trail I had just mapped out, Trent would face decades in federal prison for embezzlement and operating a Ponzi scheme. Calvin and Patricia would be indicted as co-conspirators for covering up the theft of charitable funds. They would lose the foundation. They would lose their home to the banks. They would face complete, total public ruin. They were completely out of time, completely out of money, and completely out of options. And then, as if sent by divine intervention, a photo popped up on their Instagram feed. A picture of the daughter they had thrown away 2 years ago, casually leaning against a $140,000 Porsche Panamera, paid for in straight cash. I sat back in my chair and let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. The sheer audacity of their plan was almost impressive. They did not miss me. They did not want to reconnect. They saw my post and realized I was sitting on a mountain of liquid tech wealth. The mandatory family meeting was a carefully orchestrated trap. They planned to sit me down, butter me up with an expensive steak dinner, play the role of the loving, apologetic parents, and then pitch me some fabricated high-yield family investment portfolio managed by Trent. They needed me to blindly hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars to save them from a federal indictment. They expected me to be the naive, desperate-to-be-loved scapegoat who would gladly empty her bank accounts just to finally earn a seat at their mahogany dining table. I reached over and took a slow sip of the cold green tea. A heavy, profound calm washed over my entire body. For 30 years, I had let these people make me feel small. I had let them diminish my accomplishments, disrespect my husband, and treat me like a stain on their perfect family portrait. But the power dynamic had completely shifted. They were drowning in a violent, chaotic storm of their own making, and they thought I was going to be their life raft. I hit print on my keyboard. The laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable, legally binding receipts. I gathered the bank routing numbers, the shell company incorporation documents, the secondary mortgage filings, and the federal audit notices. I slid the thick stack of papers into a sleek black leather portfolio. I loaded the digital files onto my encrypted tablet. They wanted a family meeting. They wanted to talk about legacy and generational wealth. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. But I was not bringing a checkbook. I was bringing a wrecking ball, and I was going to make absolutely sure they felt the impact of every single swing. The evening air in Atlanta was thick with humidity. As I turned my midnight blue Porsche onto the familiar winding road leading to my parents' gated community, the engine let out a low muscular growl that echoed off the massive brick facades of the neighborhood mansions. 2 years ago, driving up to these imposing iron gates would have triggered a severe anxiety attack. My chest would have tightened, my palms would have sweat against the steering wheel, and I would have spent the entire drive mentally preparing to shrink myself down to a manageable size so I would not upset my mother. Tonight, my heart rate was a steady rhythmic beat. I rested my hand on my black leather briefcase, sitting on the passenger seat, feeling the physical weight of the digital execution I was about to deliver. I punched in the visitor code at the security keypad. As the heavy iron gates swung open, I cruised up the long, sweeping driveway of Calvin and Patricia's estate. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. It was a sprawling, pristine colonial mansion with perfectly manicured hedges, dramatic landscape lighting, and towering white columns. But knowing what I now knew about their massive secondary mortgages and the impending federal audits, the entire property looked like a giant crumbling house of cards, just waiting for a strong gust of wind. They were waiting for me on the front porch. The entire cast of characters had assembled for their grand performance. I put the car in park, letting the engine idle for just a moment longer than necessary so they could truly feel the vibration of $140,000 of liquid cash sitting in their driveway. I turned off the ignition, grabbed my briefcase, and stepped out into the warm evening air. Imani was the very first person I locked eyes with. She was wearing a designer silk dress that I knew cost more than her monthly mortgage payment, but absolutely no amount of expensive fabric could hide the raw, unfiltered envy radiating from her face. Her eyes darted aggressively from the customized cream leather interior of my car to my calm, unbothered expression. For a woman who had spent her entire life defining her self-worth by her material superiority over her older sister, seeing me step out of a vehicle she could never dream of affording was a physical blow. She forced her lips into a tight, strained line, completely unable to muster even a fake smile of greeting. Standing right next to her was Trent. He was trying desperately to play the role of the slick, untouchable alpha male. He stood with his chest puffed out, wearing a tailored navy blue suit, holding a crystal glass of amber bourbon, like a prop from a Wall Street movie. But I was not looking at his expensive suit. I was looking directly at his eyes. The dark, heavy circles under them were undeniable. His skin had a grayish, sickly pallor, and his hands were gripping that crystal glass so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked like a man who had not slept an entire hour in weeks. He looked exactly like a man who knew the federal government was currently auditing his stolen charity funds. He gave me a stiff, arrogant nod, trying to project absolute dominance, but my trained eyes could smell the sheer terror radiating off his skin. Then came Calvin and Patricia. My mother practically glided down the brick front steps, her arms wide open, wearing a smile so bright and artificial it could have blinded someone. She rushed toward me and wrapped me in a suffocating perfume-drenched hug. She squeezed me tightly and dramatically exclaimed how much she had missed her beautiful eldest daughter. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. If I had not spent the previous night tracing her fraudulent tax records and offshore shell companies, I might have actually believed the emotion in her voice. My father stepped up next, placing a heavy, supposedly paternal hand on my shoulder. He gave me a solemn, deeply rehearsed look of regret. He told me that 2 years was far too long for a family to be separated. He used his best booming pastor voice to tell me that he and my mother had done a massive amount of soul-searching recently. Calvin actually looked me dead in the eye and offered a hollow, entirely fabricated apology. He said they deeply regretted losing touch over the years, and that they had simply let the overwhelming demands of their nonprofit foundation cloud their priorities. He told me they wanted to wipe the slate clean and start fresh because at the end of the day, blood is thicker than water. I did not flinch. I did not pull away, but I also did not return the hug. I simply stood there, perfectly still, letting them play out their desperate and pathetic charade. I smiled a polite, completely detached smile and thanked them for the invitation. I told my father I was very interested to hear all about this fresh start they had planned. My calm demeanor seemed to momentarily confuse Patricia. She was used to me either arguing defensively or shrinking into submissive silence. She was not used to me looking at her with the cold, calculating observation of an auditor inspecting a compromised asset. Patricia quickly recovered, clapping her hands together and ushering everyone inside. She announced that the upscale caterers had just set up the dining room and that we had a wonderful, productive evening ahead of us. Trent stepped aside to let me pass, trying to assert his dominance by offering a condescending compliment about my car. He smirked down at me and told me it was a cute little ride, casually asking if Jamal had to take out a high-interest business loan to afford the down payment. I stopped right in his doorway. I turned my head slowly, looking Trent up and down with absolute surgical precision. I kept my voice light, almost conversational. I told him I do not believe in loans, margins, or financing. I told him I paid for the car in straight cash, because unlike some people, I prefer to actually own my assets outright, rather than pretending to be wealthy by gambling with other people's money. Trent's jaw clenched so hard a muscle violently twitched in his cheek. The slick, arrogant smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a flash of genuine, naked panic. Imani grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the dining room, her eyes darting nervously between us. Calvin and Patricia pretended not to hear the exchange, practically sprinting toward the dining room table to keep the evening moving according to their carefully written script. I walked into the grand foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the imported marble floors. The house smelled of expensive catering and desperate lies. They had set the perfect stage for their grand manipulation, ready to pitch me their fabricated family investment portfolio. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase a little tighter. They were about to ask me for a life raft, and I was about to hand them a heavy iron anchor. I took my seat at the long mahogany dining table. The caterers had laid out an extravagant spread of dry-aged steaks, roasted asparagus, and truffle mashed potatoes. My parents sat at opposite ends of the table, flanking us like generals commanding a battlefield. Imani and Trent sat directly across from me. I placed my black leather briefcase on the floor right next to my chair, keeping it perfectly within arm's reach. Patricia initiated the next phase of their performance before the caterers even left the room. She poured me a glass of expensive red wine and launched into her meticulously rehearsed monologue. She spoke softly, trying to sound maternal and deeply reflective. She told me that the past 2 years of silence had given them a massive amount of time to think about our family dynamics. She actually had the absolute nerve to reframe my wedding day completely. She called their absence a tragic miscommunication caused by the overwhelming demands of their charity work. She said they were simply stretched too thin, trying to save the community, and that she deeply regretted making me feel second best. I let her speak without interrupting. I slowly cut a piece of steak and watched her paint herself as a selfless martyr who just loved her charitable causes too much to attend her own daughter's wedding. It was a masterful display of gaslighting. Calvin chimed in, right on cue, nodding solemnly. He said it was time to put the past behind us. He said holding grudges was toxic and that we needed to focus on the future, on building a unified front, because the world outside is cold and blood is the only thing you can truly rely on in times of need. Then came the pivot. It was so remarkably smooth, so perfectly choreographed, that I almost had to admire the sheer audacity of their grift. Patricia reached across the table and placed her manicured hand lightly over mine. She smiled warmly and shifted the topic entirely from her fake apology to business. She announced that their community foundation was currently experiencing unprecedented explosive growth. She sat there and lied straight to my face, claiming their donations were up by 300% and that their corporate partnerships were expanding globally. She spoke about the charity, like it was a booming tech startup, completely ignoring the fact that I already knew they were drowning in secondary mortgages and staring down the barrel of a federal audit. Calvin picked up the baton flawlessly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and lowered his voice to sound conspiratorial and exclusive. He told me that because the foundation was bringing in so much excess capital, they had decided to launch a highly curated private family investment portfolio. He said they wanted to ensure that the massive wealth they were generating stayed strictly within the family bloodline. And of course, this elite portfolio was going to be exclusively managed by their resident financial genius, Trent. Trent sat up straighter in his chair, suddenly regaining some of the arrogant swagger he had lost out in the driveway. He cleared his throat and started throwing out his hollow corporate buzzwords like confetti. He talked confidently about diversifying asset classes, leveraging high-yield offshore algorithms, and maximizing tax-sheltered growth. He spoke to me slowly and deliberately, using the exact condescending tone a teacher uses to explain basic math to a slow toddler. He mansplained finance to a woman who had just negotiated a multi-million-dollar software buyout with a global conglomerate. Trent told me that he had already secured incredibly aggressive returns for Calvin and Patricia, and that he was graciously opening up a limited window for me to buy into the fund. Imani chimed in, resting her chin on her hands, looking at me with feigned sisterly concern. She told me that since I had just stumbled into some new tech money, I desperately needed a professional to manage it before I accidentally blew it all. She said that buying a Porsche was a cute little flex, but real wealth requires intense strategy. She told me that Jamal probably did not know how to handle large sums of cash, so it was safer to keep my money with people who understood high society economics. Then Trent finally dropped the actual number. He leaned across the table, gave me a slick, practiced smile, and told me that the minimum buy-in for this elite family portfolio was $250,000. Calvin did not frame this request as an option. He framed it as an absolute expectation. He told me that handing over $250,000 to Trent was my duty to the family legacy. He said that true generational wealth is built when families pool their resources and trust the experts among them. Patricia nodded eagerly, adding that this contribution was the perfect way for me to finally prove my loyalty and officially buy my way back into their good graces. They sat there looking at me expectantly. They wanted $250,000 in liquid cash transferred directly into Trent's fraudulent shell companies by the end of the week, all brilliantly disguised as an act of familial love and generational wealth building. They needed my money to pay off the massive sums Trent had embezzled from the foundation before the federal investigators ripped their entire lives apart. They thought I was the same desperate, invisible girl who would empty her bank accounts just to earn a smile from her father and a seat at the dinner table. They waited for me to pull out my checkbook and thank them for the opportunity. I carefully placed my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. I reached for my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back on the coaster. I looked directly at Trent, then shifted my gaze to my mother and father. I gave them a polite, entirely hollow smile. I told them no thank you. I said I was not interested in contributing to this portfolio, and I would not be investing a single dollar of my money with Trent. The silence that followed was absolute. The warm, inviting atmosphere they had spent the entire evening desperately trying to cultivate vanished in a fraction of a second. It was like I had just sucked all the oxygen out of the dining room. My parents realized in real time that their carefully orchestrated trap had snapped shut on completely empty air. Patricia was the very first to break. Her meticulously crafted maternal smile twisted into a vicious, unrecognizable sneer. The loving mother facade was completely discarded the moment she realized my checkbook was staying closed. She slammed her open palm down on the mahogany table so hard the crystal wine glasses violently rattled. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face and called me a deeply selfish, hopelessly ungrateful daughter. She yelled that she had graciously opened her home to me, forgiven my 2 years of deafening silence, and offered me a prime seat at their table, only for me to throw her supreme generosity right back in her face. She said I had always been arrogant, always acting like I was somehow above the family that raised me, when in reality, I was absolutely nothing without their name. Right on cue, Imani weaponized her emotions. She let out a dramatic, trembling gasp and buried her face in her hands, forcing out a series of dry, theatrical sobs. She did not shed a single actual tear, but she wailed loudly enough for the caterers in the kitchen to hear. She cried that I was purposely trying to sabotage the family. She accused me of hoarding my newfound wealth out of pure spite, claiming I was perfectly fine, watching my own flesh and blood struggle to build a legacy, while I selfishly flaunted my money. She looked up at me, her eyes entirely dry, and spat that I was just bitterly jealous. She said I could not handle the fact that her husband was a corporate financial genius, while my husband was just a common cook, sweating over a hot stove. Then Trent stepped in. He did not yell. He did not cry. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, casually unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, and deployed the most condescending, disgustingly sexist tone I had ever had the displeasure of hearing. He held up a hand to silence my sister, playing the role of the rational, educated peacemaker, dealing with an hysterical woman. He let out a patronizing chuckle and shook his head. He told me that I was letting my petty emotional grudges cloud my business judgment. He actually looked me up and down and called my software buyout a cute little stroke of luck. Trent leaned his elbows on the table and spoke to me as if I lacked basic cognitive function. He confidently stated that tech money is incredibly volatile and that writing a little code does not equate to actual financial literacy. He told me that as a woman, I simply did not possess the aggressive market instincts or the emotional stomach to understand high-level economic dynamics. He smirked and said the institutional market would eat me alive if I tried to navigate it alone. He told me it was incredibly dangerous for a woman to hold that much liquid cash without a professional, educated man stepping in to protect her assets. He claimed he was offering me a massive personal favor by volunteering to manage my money before I foolishly squandered it all. Calvin immediately backed Trent up. My father glared at me from the head of the table and demanded I stop acting like a stubborn, rebellious child. He told me to drop the defensive attitude, respect the hierarchy of this family, and write the $250,000 check immediately so Trent could get to work building our empire. I sat perfectly still, letting their desperate insults and ridiculous ultimatums wash over me. For 30 years, this exact combination of guilt, shame, and condescension would have completely broken me. I would have internalized Patricia's rage. I would have felt immense guilt over Imani's fake tears, and I would have doubted my own intelligence after Trent's sexist monologue. I would have apologized, opened my purse, and bought my way back into their good graces. But tonight, their predictable tactics did not inflict a single scratch. They looked absolutely pathetic. I watched them unravel, realizing that their aggression was not born from a place of authority or power. It was born from pure, unadulterated terror. They were cornered animals lashing out aggressively because their survival depended entirely on my submission. They genuinely believed that if they insulted my intelligence, attacked my character, and played on my insecurities, I would eventually cave. They thought gaslighting me was the key to my bank account. I let them finish their coordinated attack. I let the echoes of their insults fade into the heavy silence of the dining room. I looked at Trent's smug, punchable face. I looked at Imani's fake distress. I looked at the sheer demanding entitlement radiating from my parents. They had completely played their hand. Now it was my turn to flip the table. I slowly reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my black leather briefcase. I placed the heavy leather briefcase directly onto the polished mahogany table, right next to my untouched plate. The loud metallic click of the brass locks echoing in the silent room made my mother flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my sleek matte black tablet. Without breaking eye contact with Trent, I tapped the screen and initiated a Bluetooth connection to the massive 85-inch smart television mounted on the wall just behind my father. The television chimed loudly, instantly snapping everyone's attention away from me and toward the bright screen. I told Trent that for a man who confidently claimed women lacked the cognitive capacity and emotional stomach for high-level finance, he had left a remarkably sloppy digital footprint. I said that a true professional would know better than to leave a trail of breadcrumbs so obvious that a simple algorithm could unravel his entire life in under 3 hours. With a single swipe of my finger, the first document appeared on the television screen. It was the official state corporate registry filing for Trent's supposedly elite wealth management firm. I read the details aloud, my voice echoing with icy surgical precision. I pointed out the registered business address. I tapped the screen again, pulling up a street view image of the exact location. It was not a gleaming skyscraper in the financial district. It was a virtual mail drop located directly above a rundown strip mall dry cleaner. I looked at Trent and casually asked if his aggressive market synergy and blockchain optimization took place next to the coin-operated washing machines. Trent's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. Imani leaned forward, her brow furrowed in confusion, claiming the document had to be photoshopped. I did not even look at her. I just swiped to the next slide. The screen flashed to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority database. I highlighted Trent's name. I showed my parents, who had worshipped this man's pedigree for years, that their golden son-in-law possessed absolutely zero advanced financial certifications. I showed them the public ledger, proving his firm managed no institutional capital whatsoever. He was not a Wall Street prodigy. He was an unlicensed amateur playing with a fake title. Trent gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning stark white. He stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to order me to turn the television off. He claimed I was violating his privacy and illegally hacking his business files. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile and informed him that every single document on that screen was a matter of public record. I told him he was just too incompetent to realize his own incompetence was public knowledge. Then I delivered the next devastating blow. I swiped the screen again, and a series of complex financial charts and offshore brokerage statements populated the television. I broke down the numbers so clearly that even Imani could not deny what she was looking at. I showed them Trent's massive catastrophic trading losses. I explained the concept of a margin call to my parents, like I was teaching a toddler basic arithmetic. I highlighted the exact dates and times the offshore banks demanded immediate liquid cash to cover the reckless, high-risk gambling debts Trent had accumulated. I watched Trent physically unravel. The slick, condescending alpha male facade completely melted away, leaving nothing but absolute naked terror. He reached up with trembling fingers and violently loosened his expensive silk tie, suddenly unable to breathe in the suffocating tension of the room. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in a flooding cage. But I was not finished. The final nail in his coffin was still waiting in the queue. I told my parents that I knew exactly how Trent managed to pay off those aggressive margin calls to keep his fake lifestyle afloat. I swiped to the final presentation slide. The television split into two side-by-side comparisons. On the left were the Internal Revenue Service tax filings for my parents' beloved community nonprofit foundation. On the right were the incorporation documents for two shell companies named Apex Financial Solutions and Horizon Strategic Consulting. I walked them through the money flow line by line, date by date. I showed the exact ledger entries where over $300,000 of charitable donations, money legally meant for underprivileged youth programs, was systematically siphoned out of the foundation under the guise of vague external consulting fees. I highlighted the routing numbers on the foundation's outgoing wire transfers and drew a bright red digital line connecting them directly to the inbound deposits of the shell companies. Then I zoomed in on the registered agent and primary beneficiary of both Apex Financial Solutions and Horizon Strategic Consulting. The name printed in bold, undeniable ink was Trent. The silence in the dining room was so absolute, so profoundly heavy, it felt like the air pressure had shifted. I had just laid out a flawless, legally binding map of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the man sitting across from me was not building generational wealth. He was actively stealing it right out from under my parents' noses. He had used his position as the prized, untouchable white son-in-law to convince Calvin and Patricia to give him access to their operational funds, and he bled their life's work completely dry to pay off his bad bets. Imani stared at the 85-inch screen, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently as the reality of her husband's crimes washed over her. She turned slowly to look at Trent, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper as she asked him if it was true. Trent could not even look at his wife. He stared down at his half-eaten, dry-aged steak sweat visibly beading on his forehead and dripping down his neck. He was hyperventilating, taking short, ragged breaths, completely incapable of formulating a single lie to save himself. The undeniable receipts were projected in high definition, towering over him and broadcasting his absolute ruin. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Trent's crumbling, pathetic display and locked eyes directly with my parents. Calvin and Patricia were sitting frozen in their high-backed mahogany chairs. The color had completely drained from their faces. They looked like two statues caught in the glaring, unmerciful light of reality. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a naive, invisible liability. Now they were staring at the exact daughter they had thrown away, holding the digital execution order to their precious Atlanta dynasty. I swiped my finger across my tablet one more time. The screen behind my father transitioned from the embezzlement flowchart to a series of highly sensitive government documents. I pointed to the left side of the massive television. I told them to look very closely at the freshly filed federal audit notice from the Internal Revenue Service and the State Attorney General. The government was officially flagging their nonprofit foundation for severe financial irregularities. Forensic accountants were already demanding line-by-line justifications for the exorbitant consulting fees paid to their beloved son-in-law. Then I pointed to the right side of the screen. I displayed the county property tax records and the recent deeds for their sprawling, pristine estate. The documents highlighted the massive secondary mortgages they had secretly taken out. They had leveraged every single ounce of equity they owned to quietly replace the $300,000 Trent had stolen before their charity board could notice the missing funds. My father's chest began to heave. He gripped the edge of the dining table, his booming, commanding pastor voice completely gone. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that I knew absolutely everything. They were entirely out of time and completely out of money. Patricia was the first to attempt a defense. She scrambled out of her chair, her manicured hands fluttering nervously in the air. She pasted on a frantic, shaky smile and tried to employ her classic manipulation tactics. She told me that I was taking these documents entirely out of context. She claimed that the secondary mortgages were simply strategic liquidity maneuvers. She actually tried to tell me that Trent was just aggressively reinvesting the foundation funds to secure a larger endowment, and that the federal audit was just a standard routine checkup that happens to all successful charities. Patricia stepped toward me, reaching out her hand, and desperately whispered that family needs to protect family when outsiders try to tear them down. I stepped back, ensuring her hands never touched my clothes. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the hardest, coldest truth she had ever heard. I told her to stop insulting my intelligence. I told her that she was standing in a heavily mortgaged house defending a man who had actively stolen her life's work simply because she was too terrified of country club gossip to admit she had been swindled. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the absolute weight of their hypocrisy crush the remaining oxygen out of the room. I reminded them of exactly where they were 2 years ago. I recounted how they demanded I reschedule the most important day of my life. They abandoned my wedding. They left 5 empty seats in the front row of my ceremony. They cast their own daughter out of the family without a second thought. And why? Because they were so fiercely desperate to attend a fake networking gala hosted by a con artist. I looked at Calvin and reminded him of how he treated my husband. I reminded him how he and Patricia constantly looked down on Jamal. They sneered at an honest, hard-working black man who built a Michelin-recognized culinary empire with his own bare hands, sweat, and relentless grind. They treated a king like he was hired help because his success did not come wrapped in a country club membership or a trust fund. Instead, they practically worshipped the ground Trent walked on. They handed Trent the keys to their foundation and total access to their financial legacy for one reason and one reason only: because he was a slick, mediocre white man with a perceived pedigree. They were so blinded by their toxic obsession with proximity to whiteness and elite social status that they allowed a fraud to drain their accounts right in front of their faces. They happily sacrificed their own flesh and blood to protect a man who was actively burying them in federal crimes. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, her lips trembling as tears of pure panic finally spilled over her perfectly contoured cheeks. She tried to stammer out an excuse, claiming they just wanted the best for the family brand, claiming they did not know Trent was drowning in offshore margin calls. I cut her off immediately. I told her ignorance is not innocence. I said that covering up a federal crime to save face at the country club makes them co-conspirators, not victims. They chose to hide the theft. They chose to take out secondary mortgages rather than report their golden boy to the authorities. I told Patricia that her profound vanity had finally bankrupted her. Calvin slumped back into his chair. The patriarch of the family, the man who had commanded rooms and dominated charity galas for decades, looked completely broken. He stared at the 85-inch screen projecting his financial ruin and buried his face in his hands. He had nothing to say. There were no more manipulative sermons left to preach. There were no more guilt trips to leverage. Imani was sobbing openly now, shrinking away from Trent as if he were carrying a contagious disease. Trent remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead, trapped in the inescapable reality of his own making. The grand commanding dining room felt like a graveyard. I had systematically dismantled every single lie, every fake apology, and every shred of their toxic superiority. I stood there holding my tablet, completely untouchable, watching the architects of my lifelong pain choke on the ashes of their own burned-down empire. The suffocating silence in the dining room was suddenly shattered by the sound of a fist slamming against the polished mahogany table. Calvin shot up out of his chair, his sudden movement knocking over a crystal water glass that shattered onto the hardwood floor. In a last spectacular act of desperate delusion, my father attempted to summon the booming, commanding pastor voice he had used to control me for 30 years. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. He demanded that I stop this ridiculous technological presentation and write the check immediately. He yelled that I was still his daughter, that I had millions of dollars sitting in my bank accounts, and that $250,000 was absolutely nothing to me. Calvin actually had the breathtaking nerve to command me to hand over the cash to save the family name from absolute public ruin. He tried to guilt-trip me, claiming that God would harshly judge me for turning my back on my own blood during their darkest hour. I did not shrink under his booming voice. I did not flinch. I looked at the man who had abandoned me at the altar, the man who had happily worshipped a white con artist over his own hard-working black daughter, and I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the freezing surgical smile of an executioner. I told my father that his precious family name was already dead, and that no amount of my hard-earned tech money could ever resurrect it. I slowly turned my attention back to Trent. He was completely slumped in his chair, taking short, ragged breaths, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. I kept my voice perfectly calm and entirely conversational. I told Trent that he really should have stopped his crime spree while he was only facing state embezzlement charges from a local nonprofit. I told him that greed is a spectacularly dangerous disease because it tricks mediocre men into believing they are invisible. I watched Trent swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I told the room that exactly 48 hours ago, long before Patricia made her frantic phone call to invite me to this mandatory dinner, my personal security servers triggered a massive glowing red alert. Trent, in a desperate, flailing panic to cover his collapsing offshore accounts, had attempted to secure a massive commercial bridge loan from a Tier 1 federal bank. He needed millions to stop the margin calls. But because his own credit was completely destroyed and his fake wealth management firm had zero assets, he desperately needed a guarantor with spotless high net worth financials. So he decided to use mine. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth. I explained exactly what their golden son-in-law had done. Trent had somehow acquired my social security number, likely by digging through my parents' old tax files, and he electronically forged my digital signature on a federal corporate loan application. He actually thought he could quietly leverage my name, secure the cash pay off his angry investors, and pretend none of this ever happened. I leaned across the dining table, resting my hands on the cool mahogany, and looked directly into Trent's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him that he had just tried to forge the digital signature of a woman who literally designs predictive security architecture for global conglomerates. I explained that my personal encrypted network caught the unauthorized credit ping before his fraudulent application even reached the bank's underwriting department. I tracked the IP address of the submission straight back to his unsecured, incredibly basic home network in under 60 seconds. Imani screamed. She lunged forward, grabbing Trent by the lapels of his expensive suit, shaking him and screaming, asking him if it was true. Trent could not even look at his wife. He just shook his head rapidly, unable to form a single coherent word, tears of pure, unadulterated terror spilling down his face. I stood up from my chair and casually buttoned my blazer. I looked down at Calvin and Patricia, who were now trembling uncontrollably. I told them that they no longer needed to worry about the Internal Revenue Service auditing their foundation because the IRS was going to have to wait in line. When someone commits identity theft and wire fraud using federal banking institutions, it instantly becomes a massive federal crime. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a single stamped manila folder, and dropped it right onto my father's empty dinner plate. I told them I did not just spend last night printing out colorful graphs for a dinner presentation. Yesterday morning, I drove my Porsche directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in downtown Atlanta. I sat down with a federal agent. I handed over the forged loan application, the IP tracking logs, the foundation tax returns, and the offshore margin calls. I handed the federal government the entire undeniable dossier. I told my family that this was not a threat or a negotiation. The investigation was already an active, escalating federal operation, and Trent was going down for all of it. The heavy silence in the dining room was suddenly broken by a sound that made the blood freeze in Trent's veins. Through the massive custom-built windows of my parents' estate, the faint but unmistakable wail of police sirens began to echo in the distance. They were growing louder by the second, cutting through the humid Atlanta night. The federal government does not send polite warning emails when they are dealing with multi-million-dollar wire fraud and identity theft. They send tactical units. Trent collapsed forward, gripping his chest as he began to violently hyperventilate, gasping for air that his lungs simply refused to process. Patricia slid out of her chair and crumpled onto the hardwood floor, letting out a guttural, agonizing sob as the reality of her shattered social empire finally crushed her. Calvin just stared blankly at the manila folder on his plate, completely paralyzed by his impending ruin. Imani was screaming, begging Trent to tell her it was a nightmare. I did not stay to watch the feds kick the door in. I reached onto the table, picked up my black leather briefcase, and grabbed the heavy metallic keys to my Porsche. I did not say a single word of goodbye. I simply turned my back on the people who had treated me like a disposable asset for 35 years and walked out the front door. As I slid into the driver's seat and pressed the ignition, the engine roared to life, completely drowning out the sound of my mother's wailing. I drove out of the gated community just as 3 black, unmarked federal SUVs swarmed past me, their red and blue lights reflecting off the hood of my car. I did not check my rearview mirror. I just drove home to my husband. 6 months have passed since that night, and the fallout was absolutely biblical. Trent was federally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. Because he tried to defraud a major federal banking institution, the judge denied him bail. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting a trial that will inevitably end with a very long prison sentence. The federal auditors completely dismantled my parents' beloved nonprofit foundation. The state attorney general seized their remaining assets, and the bank officially foreclosed on their pristine gated estate. Calvin and Patricia were publicly and ruthlessly disgraced. They were outcast from every single elite social circle, stripped of their country club memberships, and forced to move into a tiny rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city. Imani, stripped of her husband's stolen money and our parents' financial bailouts, was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Her designer wardrobe and luxury SUVs were repossessed, leaving her to finally face the real world without a golden parachute. As for me, I am currently sitting on the private rooftop patio of Jamal's restaurant. The dining room downstairs is fully booked with a 3-month waiting list, and his newly awarded Michelin star plaque hangs proudly by the entrance. The evening breeze is warm, and I am drinking a glass of perfectly chilled white wine. Aunt Vivian is sitting across from me, laughing at a joke Jamal just made as he brings us a plate of customized appetizers. I look at my husband and my aunt, and I feel a profound, unshakable peace. People will constantly try to tell you that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that you must forgive toxic relatives simply because you share the same DNA. But I learned the hard way that DNA is just biology. It does not equal loyalty, it does not equal respect, and it certainly does not equal love. True family consists of the people who celebrate your victories in the light and protect your peace in the dark. Walking away from the toxic status-obsessed people who tried to dim my light was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. You owe absolutely nothing to people who only remember you exist when they need to use you. Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand and cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace? What was your ultimate boundary-setting victory? I want to read all about your triumphs in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Remember to hold your head high, protect your energy, and never apologize for building your empire in peace. The profound lesson here is that DNA is merely a biological coincidence. It never guarantees loyalty, respect, or love. For decades, I allowed toxic expectations to dictate my self-worth, shrinking myself to fit where I was entirely undervalued. True empowerment arrives when you stop seeking validation from people who only view you as a disposable resource. Establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of malice, it is the ultimate form of self-preservation. You possess every right to protect your peace walk away from manipulation and consciously build a chosen family that celebrates your light instead of trying to extinguish it. Drop a comment below sharing the hardest boundary you have ever had to set to protect your peace, and hit that subscribe button to join our community of cycle breakers.